Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
The presidential election. It's finally behind us. After what felt like a long, dirty, and frankly, utterly exhausting campaign, Karol Nawrocki has been elected to the office of president. And both his victory and the entire course of this election, the topics that dominated it, the rhetoric the candidates used to win your support, all of it is clear proof of a political shift to the right. And this isn't just a Polish phenomenon. Oh no, this is a very broad trend. I'd say generally European, but we also have to include the United States in this picture. So, it's a general Western political trend. However, in Europe, this trend takes on a special additional dimension, the dimension of the fight for the very future and shape of the European political system. I cordially invite you to join me as we delve into the Polish elections and the future of the European political system. All right, so the European political right has two basic dimensions. The first is completely obvious. The right wing is gaining growing social support. And I'm talking about the right wing that's forming either in opposition or at least alongside the existing right wing. Often, when these established right-wing parties enter into the mainstream alliance, that very characteristic current in European politics, a left-leaning alliance between liberals and Christian Democrats, they tend to lose their distinct character. And it's not just the right wing. This affects all participants of this very broad alliance, which is most visible at the level of the European Parliament. Members of such coalitions often have to sacrifice their core ideas on the altar of becoming a party of power or a camp of power. And this means that on the flanks of this alliance, you see environments emerging that have a clear ideology at the heart of their activities. That's why I think such environments, like Partia Razem in Poland, will sometimes attract the electorate of the traditional left wing. This traditional left, after entering this broad alliance, becomes difficult to distinguish from other participants. But the left today is an environment that is, to a certain extent, well, let's call it dormant. The wind is evidently blowing from the right side. And it's on the right flank of this broad alliance that organizations or parties challenging the current system of power distribution on the continent are gaining traction. We see it in Italy, France, Great Britain, Germany, Sweden, Poland, well, actually everywhere across Europe. Environments that were recently labeled extreme in terms of their support and popularity, today they are absolutely key players on any given political scene. Either everyone must cooperate in a coalition to prevent them from governing, or they are already co-governing, or they're poised to form a government within 1 or 2 election cycles. And while this is an interesting topic, we could certainly look at the degree of advancement of this trend in individual countries. It seems quite obvious. The second dimension I want to talk about, while perfectly visible during the election campaign in Poland, is less obvious but equally interesting. It's the fact that mainstream parties are trying to speak the language of the growing right, or simply adopt its postulates. I don't know if you remember, but I talked about this at the time of Trump's election, or right after it, that this is probably how the election campaign in Poland would look. I also talked about it a few years ago, that Christian Democratic and Social Democratic parties are taking actions that, if taken by the AfD just a few years ago, would have made the blood of mainstream media boil. It would simply have been unacceptable. Today, it's Starmer in Great Britain, a man from the Labour Party, a left-liberal environment, who says we need to shut down migration because the Conservatives have gone too far with openness. He's saying that the right to live in Great Britain is neither a privilege nor a right that everyone can simply have, and that we cannot become an island inhabited by people who feel no connection to each other, who have nothing in common. In Poland, its civic platform. It was formed by the party that has always been the most radical opponent of mass migration. And of all the candidates, Rafał Trzaskowski was the one who said there's nothing like the Green Party, and it seems to me that no sane observer has any doubt that Rafał Trzaskowski tried in this campaign to build an electoral platform that was intended to appeal to at least some right-wing voters. From economic views to migration, to the Green Party, there were many postulates directly referencing the needs of the right-wing voter. And while this experiment, on a general European level, is still ongoing, and it will be very interesting to see how it all plays out in the long run. So far, we have much more evidence that this trend, this blind pursuit of the voice of the angry people, brings the establishment more harm than good. For many reasons. First of all, it's completely devoid of any credibility. And I could elaborate on that, but I don't think it's necessary. Secondly, it completely channels political discussion into the topics that their opponents, the opponents of the mainstream, are pushing. It constantly reminds people why they are angry and for whom. And finally, thirdly, this flirtation with the right wing demobilizes their own electorate. This electorate is already fragmented within this wide coalition of the left wing, liberal, and center right.
And I think this is a very interesting thread. For me personally, it's fascinating from a political analysis perspective, but I think it can be perfectly summed up by one statistic. Rafał Trzaskowski was voted for by a smaller percentage of Sławomir Menczen's voters from the first round than the percentage of Adrian Zandberg's voters who, in the second round, voted for Karol Nawrocki. In other words, and of course I'm talking about percentages as the raw numbers would look different, a larger percentage moved from the extreme left flank to Karol Nawrocki than from the extreme right flank to Rafał Trzaskowski. Rafał Trzaskowski, drinking beer with Menczen, not only didn't convince anyone, it seems he actually unconvinced a few people. And again, this is just a Polish element of a much wider trend. So far, it's difficult for me to find an example where adopting the rhetoric of this growing right wing actually cuts off its oxygen supply. It's simply not credible today in the mouths of the very people who pursued this or that policy just a few months ago. It just doesn't work. Another tool for limiting the growing right wing, of course, is the dimension of justice. We've seen it in Romania, in France. It will be interesting to see how the situation develops in Germany in this regard. And the term independent dimension of justice very often means, let's be honest, a system that is under the control of sustained power elites. And it's worth giving an example here. In France, the Constitutional Council, the Constitutional Tribunal, which decided that it was okay for Marine Le Pen to abstain from voting, and that it was okay to ban someone from running in presidential elections due to unfair spending of European Parliament money. This verdict was issued by a man, or the head of the Constitutional Council is a guy, who just a few months ago was a prominent politician in Emmanuel Macron's party, and for almost 40 years he was a politician of the Socialist Party. And here, in this matter, especially for people with left liberal views, a powerful temptation arises, because these circles, due to their long presence in judicial institutions, have a political advantage in the political life of the judiciary. A temptation opens up to adopt this rhetoric of an independent judiciary that fights populism. But I would strongly recommend being careful when using justice to play a political game in such a way as to, for example, ban someone from running in presidential elections. And let's be clear, given the importance of presidential elections for simple reasons, this is truly playing with fire, because it doesn't always have to work in just one direction. Another extremely important, and to some extent effective, tool for limiting the influence of growing right-wing parties is the European central dimension of politics, where this alliance between the left and the liberals is most visible, most ostentatious. And this is truly a camp of power. I mean, this is a camp that fully controls politics at the European level. It controls the European institutions, from the Parliament to the European Commission, and by controlling these institutions, it supports the members of this political camp in internal political games. It was quite a devastating speech or entry from all the nations by the German MEP who, after Karol Nawrocki's election, said that you have to think about what this Polish rule of law is like and see if this money really should go to Poland. But in fact, it seems to me that at least in recent days and weeks,
no one has spoken so openly about these duplicitous standards operating at the level of the European Union as the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Radosław Sikorski. Please show me another country that has suspended the right to apply for asylum. I say this as a beneficiary of asylum. And we would have proven it. If peace had done it, it would have been an adventure for the whole of Europe. So how is it that you can prove it, and if peace had done it, it would have been an adventure? Or if you have authority, if you have won with the populists, and if you have credibility, they believe that this is only temporary. The minister is, of course, right. If peace had suspended the right to apply for asylum, Poland, in the eyes of the European elites, would have become a fascist country. And with all certainty, due to the obvious breaking of European law, we would have had to bear harsh financial consequences. We don't bear them, not because of a difference in actions, but because of a difference in who undertook this type of action. Should the European political system, and how long can it still function on these kinds of rules? Because the obvious double standards, all these sanitary cordons, excluding political debates and political circles, all this might have worked in the past. It might have worked so far because it concerned a limited number of political circles after all. And it could have been treated as something incidental.
And again, we return to the general European political landscape. This type of social movement, of real social emotion, cannot be kept marginalized, kept behind a sanitary cordon, without delegitimizing the entire political system of Europe, because this system must respond to social changes. If it doesn't respond to social changes, it will be swept off the face of the earth, in this, in the next, or in the election cycle after that. An attempt to maintain the institutional status quo must sooner or later lead to the delegitimization of the European political system. And I think that this is a real risk, especially considering how tight this European bubble is. This is just such a bubble in which everyone with different, non-mainstream views is treated as someone who, well, smells like socks. Someone very much unwanted in the same room. And this is not healthy, because this political system must respond to social emotions and social changes. Because if it doesn't, it will only become less democratic. The fact is, there is another way. It is possible to incorporate what used to be a margin into the core of European politics. Italy is an example. The Italians show that this is possible. Meloni shows that this is possible. She has walked this path. But this is a specific case, also because of the scale and importance of Italy. But above all, it seems to me that Meloni and her party, the Brothers of Italy, from the ECR, that is, from the very faction in which Law and Justice is also present, this party, Meloni, rules in a coalition with Forza Italia, that is, Forward Italy, with the EPP party, from the very core of the European political establishment. Tajani, who was the chairman of the European Parliament, who was a European commissioner, is now a minister in Meloni's government. So this coalition of this new, only recently, suspect, right wing, this coalition with the establishment, it seems to me, provides a certain cover, some immunity. Today, for example, there are no charges when it comes to the rule of law. Italy is certainly a rule of law country. But should it really look like this? And can it look like this? Doesn't it lead to the delegitimization of the political system if it doesn't respond to changes in the social structure? If it doesn't respond to democratic elections?
In addition, there's one more phenomenon worth mentioning, because so far these environments have often been so stigmatized, the reach and influence so stigmatized that it simply doesn't fall out. You cannot vote for them. And today, telling someone that it's inappropriate to vote for someone, that you cannot vote for someone, it very clearly doesn't work. And this is one of the biggest surprises of the Polish election campaign, because the government camp, which had absolutely all the tools at its disposal to conduct a campaign that was, colloquially speaking, positive, to propose something, actually focused almost 100% on disgusting the opponent's candidate, on saying why it was not worth voting for the opponents. And today, it very clearly doesn't work. For many reasons, we are already living in times of a radical crisis of authorities, the lack of publicly respected authorities. There are no people today in Polish public or political life who would be widely respected. Everyone has their own authorities, so the fact that in some media or in some committees it will be said that it absolutely does not fall out to vote for someone, there's no real-world transition for that today, because these bubbles have simply dispersed. And they have also dispersed due to the dramatic crisis of the media, in which the boundary of compromise shifts more and more from election to election. And it seems to me that in Poland, quite unnoticed, we have crossed a truly red line when it comes to the behavior of the media and their commitment to this or that candidate. Because in Poland, a large part of journalists are people who have stopped even caring about appearances, that they are journalists and not political activists dressed as journalists. Today, in Rzeczpospolita or TVN, no one pretends anymore. No one even pretends that they are not involved in any political dispute. On the day of the elections, in Rzeczpospolita, we saw that there was a lack of votes from Mencen or Brown's voters. In TVN, we saw "Hello Wrocław, hello Katowice, you have to vote more." Of course, only a fool will believe that it was about pro-turnout content. These were content straight, well, not straight, but obviously agitating on behalf of one candidate or another. And when journalists on TV, not openly, but quite obviously, agitate on behalf of one of the candidates on election day, it's something that should cause absolute outrage in everyone. It didn't cause it because it's only a thousandth confirmation of something, or a state, that we know perfectly well. I don't know if it makes sense to develop this topic because whatever it is, everyone sees it.
And of course, the last thing is the technological and information revolution. Today, politicians have a much greater ease in building their own reach. They don't need mediators in the form of traditional media. And non-traditional media forms often pose a much better competition against these old establishment media. So today, there is no monopoly on managing information, access to information, and on managing prestige, on giving a lot of power to one environment or another. No matter how many curses are thrown at populists, the extreme right, dangerous unions, it doesn't matter. This is a big revolution. Therefore, the attempt to take over the postulates and rhetoric of this growing right simply doesn't work. Using the dimension of justice to limit its importance is playing with fire. Using European institutions and their European backbone inevitably leads to the delegitimization of the very political system they are trying to uphold. And there is no end to the monopoly on the distribution of information and the management of prestige. Does this mean that the growth of this new right is something unprotected? That in a moment all of Europe will be ruled by environments considered absolutely extreme just 5 to 10 years ago? Of course not. This means that who will rule in the national or European dimension will largely depend not on what someone will say about a given politician, what their opinion will be, what will be written by this or that prestigious newspaper, but on the quality of governance. To a certain extent, this is very good information. Notice that in this election campaign, the election campaign itself had relatively little significance. I mean, all these unbelievable twists and turns, these moments when it seemed that now it's out of the question because someone did something during the election debate, because someone said something, because someone drank beer with someone. In the end, it turned out that what really mattered was the basic barometer of satisfaction with the government's actions. This was the fundamental factor that decided the election result. This was confirmed by the Prime Minister saying that, now we will get to work. Only the Prime Minister of a government who, in the middle of his term, because politicians will soon go on their well-deserved holidays and will probably return to work in the fall, the Prime Minister of a government who, in the middle of his term, says, now we will finally get to work. On one hand, it's a terrible diagnosis about the consequences of one's own failure. But on the other hand, what kind of testimony does that show about the government itself?
And while I, of course, have been thinking about this for a long time, you know that from my point of view, it's clear that a distinct and obvious benefit for all solutions would be to lower the temperature of political dispute, to recreate the possibility for the basic exchange of political thoughts, the possibility of conducting a real political debate. It's clear to me that we need to incorporate social moods, whatever they may be, into the democratic process, into the decision-making process, within the framework of democratic procedures. It's clear that we should lower the temperature and be able to talk to each other. But at the same time, I'm not naive, and I know that this will not happen. And it seems to me that both at the national level and at the European level, a fight awaits us. And because the tool of this fight will be the European political system, not the space within which this fight will take place, but the tool of the fight will be the European political system, the survival of this system, its shape, will depend on the outcome of this battle. And this makes us very turbulent when it comes to the way politics functions, both at the national level, but also as a consequence because these processes are taking place. Poland is not an island here. These processes are taking place in other countries. This will have an impact on the shape of European politics.